Horror remakes are a staple of the genre, but the great ones are few and far between. And those great ones aren't always recognized in their time. Some hit an immediate chord with fans, while others take decades to find the appreciation they deserve. 1988's The Blob, written by Chuck Russell and Frank Darabont and directed by Russell, and remaking the 1958 movie of the same name, is one of those remakes that both floundered on initial release and has not quite gotten the complete modern reappraisal that something like John Carpenter's The Thing has achieved. But to me, it's a perfect example of how and why to remake a well-known horror movie, taking a well-known but incredibly flawed original and making the most of its central concept. 1958's The Blob, on the other hand, written by Kay Lineker and Theodore Simonson and directed by Irvin Yeworth, is emblematic of its time. Inspired by Cold War fears but limited by what was acceptable at the time, and becoming a cultural touchstone more in its ideas than actual content. Russell and Darabont's The Blob is one of the best horror movies of the 80s, but you rarely see it mentioned in that conversation. And from the cult drive-in origins of the 1958 original and its forgotten sequel, to the grotesque, incredibly fun update, let's discover how these two monster movies reflect the massive changes that happened in society and horror in the 3 decades between. Let's dive deep into The Blob, an all-time great horror remake. The original Blob is, well, not good, but it has its charms, especially for anyone fond of 50s sci-fi and horror. Personally, I think that describing a movie as having aged poorly is a terrible way to evaluate art, because it shows a lack of ability in viewing art through the context of the time. On the flip side, we also shouldn't use age as an excuse for the quality of a movie, as it dismisses shortcomings that were there from the start, and it allows us to not appropriately interface with the context of the material. So, what was the state of film and horror when The Blob creeped its way into theaters? 1953's The Wild One and 1955's Rebel Without a Cause are touchstones in the history of mid-century film because they're playing off the rising tide of teen culture with their stories of rebellious youth looking for purpose. But what you may not realize today is that the term teenager and the cultural and societal definitions of it didn't start until the 1940s. In the decade before World War II, teenage children began to be enrolled in higher numbers in school and moved out of the factories that had dominated their lives in the early 20th century. Post-World War II, the economic boom of the US and the rise of the car afforded teens freedom and money to do what they wanted. A new age of freedom for teens meant a new age of fears for parents, with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover reporting that the nation can expect an appalling increase in the number of crimes that will be committed by teenagers in the years ahead. The new teenager classification also meant a brand new and extremely profitable group to market to, and we can see that really take shape in the films of the 50s. These weren't the cautionary tales of rebellion, but instead the beach parties and hangout movies that became their own subgenre, all starring teen icons. Alongside these came a new wave of horror movies with a sci-fi bent, propelled by the Cold War and space exploration, where invaders from beyond the stars stood in for the unknown horrors of outer space and the more immediate fears of the Soviet Union. This coincided with the rise of the drive-in movie theater, leveraging the spread of cars and teen dates to bring in droves of customers every weekend. And so, The Blob was created to be the perfect intersection of these 3 aspects. Specifically, it was movie distributor Jack Harris who wanted to make a film to break into the industry, who wound up turning to Valley Forge Films and director Irvin Yeworth to make it possible. A strange choice. Valley Forge and Yeworth had almost exclusively made Christian and educational films and TV specials, but I guess there was just something about that Blob, and the money it would bring, that convinced them to take a chance. Really, it was the idea to make a movie that came first, and the idea for the movie that came second, with Yeworth eventually latching onto a simple idea. This mineral, said Yeworth, if you get involved with it, can absorb your flesh. That would become a script by Kay Lineker and Theodore Simonson, at first titled The Molten Meteor, and then The Glob, and eventually The Blob. As for the story itself, there's not really all that much to it. One of the most notable elements of The Blob is that it stars Steve McQueen in his first leading film role. Then 28, playing 18, looking 38. It's fine, the guy was craggy, it was part of his charm. And McQueen is totally fine here as Steve. Hey, that's convenient. An upright, responsible young man out on the town for the night with his girlfriend Jane, played by Anita Corso, when a small meteor crashes into the outskirts of town and attaches itself to a homeless man, only to devour him and everyone else it conveniently traps in small rooms. Off screen, of course. This is a Christian film. But given its teen audience, almost every adult and authority figure just won't listen to our teenage hero's insistence on a very slow alien invasion. So it becomes the clean-cut teens like Steve, teaming up with the local street toughs like Tony Mamaluke and his gang here, to try and sound a warning before it's too late. With the growing blob weak to cold, and stopped with a whole mess of fire extinguishers before the military drop it in the Arctic. Beyond its teens and very easy to not pay attention to plot for drive-in goers who might be very distracted while watching, The Blob is absolutely a product of its Cold War time. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, propelling the Cold War into space, and sparking fears of what might come from the skies at any moment. The Blob itself, which grows and consumes everything, is a literal red menace, destroying small-town America and sparking paranoia and panic in the modern vision of the country. That's a pretty great premise for a broadly appealing horror movie aimed squarely at the widest audience possible. In execution, it's pretty underwhelming. While the special effects are fun, the tiny budget means they're few and far between. And so much of this movie consists of people pointing at something off-screen and telling you what's happened. It's the ultimate example of violating the #1 rule of cinema: show, don't tell. Christopher Nolan would be so proud. I will say that I think the film looks great. Lots of rich color, and the effects are fun, with the Blob mostly silicone colored with red vegetable dye, filmed on tilted miniature sets to get the gloop to move, and time-lapse to seem faster. They also used methyl cellulose, which makes you poop real good, and even a weather balloon. How good that looks really varies from scene to scene. And of course, the moment of everyone running out of the Blob-infested theater is iconic. But there's not much else to latch onto here. Made for only $110,000, The Blob would make more than $4 million. At first released as the second in a double feature with I Married a Monster from Outer Space, before its popularity moved it into the main feature slot. The success made The Blob into something of a cultural touchstone, as well as its annoyingly catchy theme song. Written by Burt Bacharach and Mac David and performed by the 5 Blobs. They were a bit of a one-hit wonder. In the years afterward, The Blob would maintain a cult appreciation, more for its concept than its execution. And it also received a 1972 sequel, Beware! The Blob, but also called Son of Blob, The Blob 2, and The Blob Returns. Which, like, you can't make me talk about Beware the Blob. You're not my real dad. The Blob's time to shine, however, would come 30 years after the original. Earlier this year, I talked about 1981's Hell Night in my Unsung Slashers video. And beyond it being an underrated entry in the subgenre, it was also the place where screenwriter Frank Darabont met then production assistant Chuck Russell. The two quickly hit it off and wrote the script for a Blob remake. However, when they submitted it to New Line Cinema, founder Bob Shaye turned it down, and instead had the duo take over A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors in 1987. Russell's first time directing a feature film. And with their major financial success, the duo were able to get their Blob script into production. I first saw The Blob when I was a kid on a household TV, said Russell. It was kinda poorly done, but it was one of those things that stays in your head. David Cronenberg proved you could take a similar 1950s film with its similar kitschy idea and expand on it. With Jack Harris optioning Russell the rights to the film for only $1, the movie was underway. Russell and Darabont's film follows a very similar story to the original, with a meteor crashing on the outskirts of a small town, this time Arborville, California instead of a nameless Pennsylvania city. At first hitching a ride on a homeless man and slowly growing as our teenage heroes try to convince the authorities to help stop the monster before it's too late. But the massive differences aren't in the larger plot points, but in the details. With the remake taking a very different outlook on both the origin of the Blob and the ways in which its characters react to this tidal wave of terror. While the film sets up Paul to be our all-American football player hero and love interest in a role clearly meant to echo the original's Steve, it quickly pulls the rug out from under us by brutally killing him off. From there, the focus shifts to rebellious biker Brian, played by Kevin Dillon, and Steve's love interest, Meg, played by Shawnee Smith, who are questioned by both parental and legal authorities at every turn. Really, this blob has a strong anti-authoritarian streak that it works to justify over its runtime. Cops, soldiers, doctors, parents, everyone is shown to be either deeply mistaken in their views or purposefully lying. And that brings us to the biggest change that occurs in the matter of Blob v. Blob. While the original's outer space fears are clearly a Cold War byproduct, with our Red Menace invader an unknown alien entity, the ultimate foreigner, Russell and Darabont reveal that the creature is actually a US government bioweapon experiment that accidentally crash-landed in the town. So despite the monster being the source of immediate death and terror, its origins and the cover-up around it point toward the government as the true fear. In the original, the military is seen as the ultimate savior, swooping in at the end to permanently stop the blob. Here, a special government force arrives by the end of Act 1, claiming to be there to stop the unexpected infection, but really having known about it the whole time, and ultimately more interested in studying the creature than saving lives. Even then, this special unit is useless against the monster. So what happened in the 30 years between original and remake to change the points of view behind the blob so drastically? Well, let's head back to right after our original jelly had been put back in the jar. John F. Kennedy is elected president and Psycho is released in 1960. The Berlin Wall is built in 61. JFK is assassinated in 63. The Civil Rights Act is passed in 64. US active combat in Vietnam begins in 65. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated and Night of the Living Dead is released in 68. Apollo 11 lands on the moon in 69. The US withdraws fully from Vietnam and The Exorcist is released in 73. The Watergate scandal ousts Nixon and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is released in 74. Halloween is released in 78. Ronald Reagan becomes president and Friday the 13th is released in 80. The Iran-Contra affair and the AIDS epidemic begin in 81. The Thing is released in 82. And the Challenger space shuttle explodes in 86. 3 decades of expansion, war, scandal, and a changing relationship between horror and the social fears it was translating for audiences. In 1958, Pew Research showed that 73% of Americans trusted the government to do what is right. By 1988, that average was down to 41%. It's shrunk even lower since then, dipping into the teens in the mid-2010s. But what's clear is that the general American public's relationship with the US government had been irrevocably harmed by the events of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and nothing could change that. So what you have is a very different political and social climate in which Russell and Darabont's film is made, moving our fears from the unknown of space to the known of government abuse and cover-up. The tiny town of Arborville is very reminiscent of the golden age of America, with diners, football games, and meeting the parents on your first date all echoing the era of the original. The town is so small and isolated that a high school football game is enough to empty it out, turning it into a ghost town vision of a world consumed by the blob. However, the attitudes of the people that fill the town are modern. More premarital sex, more open rebellion, a clear disdain between police and teens, and young kids dying to see the latest Friday the 13th knockoff. This remake knows the taste and attitudes of its target audience and is directly reflecting them in its characters. More importantly, the central character of Brian, a high school rebel with an extreme anti-authority streak, is proven right throughout. His lack of confidence in the local cops and doctors is right. His instinct to not trust the government squad is correct, and his skills with a motorcycle and blue-collar work experience save the day. Slowly, Meg comes around to Brian's point of view and helps stop the monster because she thinks for herself.
Come on, you son of a bitch.
The conspiracy theory, especially any related to the US government, had almost become mainstream after the JFK assassination, and it's a core idea of this remaking. In the end, it's not the government that solves the blob problem, but creates it. And while everything here is translated through the really heightened and ultimately fun first and foremost story, there's this lingering idea that even a seemingly idyllic town in the US could be wiped off the face of the earth by the government it has to live under. Of course, the greatest hallmark of Russell's remake is the incredible, brutal, gruesome, and so very gross special effects. The Blob and its many dissolving victims were brought to life by makeup effects designer and department head Tony Gardner, in his first head role on a film after personnel changes put him in charge. And while Gardner would go on to have a role in plenty of incredible effects in the following decades, The Blob is his effects masterpiece. These moments are so extreme, so unflinchingly brutal, that I think they often purposefully cross over into the comedic, with a continuing B story about the kids sneaking into a super campy and cliched Friday the 13th knockoff, underlining the film's self-aware nature of wanting to put on a spectacular show for modern horror fans. All of this plays up the body horror of the central concept, riding the wave of grotesque fears of our own flesh in the 80s by depicting the slow, agonizing death of anyone touched by the Blob. What's most terrifying to me is that its victims are fully aware as they're trapped inside the creature, unable to scream for help and dissolve before our eyes. It would be completely terrifying if the movie wasn't having so much fun. We're long gone from the days of someone looking at the Blob, screaming, and then being gone. Instead, what we have is this. And given that the Blob's weakness is the cold, Russell and Darabont take the next logical step and make the creature boiling hot, with victims not just absorbed but brutally melted within its growing ooze. To make all those on-screen deaths come to life, Gardner had to use essentially every trick in the book, adapting to the needs of each scene with the Blob Shop, composed of creature effects coordinators Lyle Conway and Stuart Ziff, and post-production opticals and miniature work by Greg Jean, DreamQuest, and All Effects. The Blob itself, when covering a victim, was cast in stiff rubber, with silk injected with methyl cellulose forming a blob quilt that would be laid over the victim for an oozing, moving, seemingly liquid surface. Puppeteers would then manipulate and move the flowing surface and move sacks for greater animation. Altogether, the contraptions would weigh hundreds of pounds and require an entire team including actors and puppeteers to bring it to life. However, the Blob team ran into lots of difficulty in executing the gags during production, as nothing really went as they planned and had to improvise on the fly. Just getting the Blob to perform was difficult, said Gardner. When combined with miniature sets, dolls, composites, stop motion, and every type of puppetry, you get a living, terrifying monster that you can never predict. It's incredible. What also sets the Blob apart is its absolutely cutthroat nature. It's a movie that really doesn't play nice, whereas the original went out of its way to make it clear that a dog did not actually get eaten. Once again, told not shown, no one is off limits. Our local sheriff and his waitress love interest are teased at having a connection, only for both to be consumed before they can even say their feelings. Not only that, but the sheriff is revealed to already be in the Blob, denying the hope of a rescue and subverting expectations of some sort of gruesome scene. That's bleak, but not as ballsy as the decision to kill off the young boy who's friends with our lead's brother. Wild. Comparatively, the third act of The Blob is not as strong as its first two, as we move from creeping terror to outright chaos, and the gooey monster becomes more of a rampaging beast, complete with some green screen and compositing that's pretty obvious, and ultimately can't match the really impressive work that came before. Still, I think it's a really fun climax because Brian and Meg get the chance to be flawed and believable heroes as government forces fall to pieces. And with one final scene that shows our resident pastor, scarred and driven insane by his encounter with the Blob, Russell and Darabont tease the idea of a film commenting on religious fervor and exploitation in the Midwest. Unfortunately, that tease for more Blob would never come to pass. The Blob would go on to underperform at the box office upon release on August 5th, 1988, making only $8.2 million on its $10 million budget, quickly being swept away by the release of Nightmare on Elm Street 4: The Dream Master. And while contemporary 80s horror remakes like John Carpenter's The Thing and David Cronenberg's The Fly have gone on to become renowned by both horror fans and film critics alike, The Blob has always somewhat been left to the wayside as a curious, gross oddity, never really breaking through in the 35 years since. Now, just a little longer than the amount of time that separated the original from Russell's version, I would love to see a new vision of The Blob, reflecting all the changes in horror and society that have happened in the time since, and affording its filmmakers the chance to use this shapeless terror to reflect new fears and modern critiques, and hopefully unleash some killer practical effects. Even if The Blob never returns, I absolutely love 1988's new, shocking, B-movie vision of creeping, melting horror, with an origin far scarier and more immediate than any terror from outer space. A vision waiting to consume you. Thanks for watching today's video, and a return yet again to horror remakes this year. This will be the third horror remake video that I've done this year, following my videos on Evil Dead and Night of the Living Dead. Now, this isn't something that I planned this year, but I guess I was just drawn to the topic naturally. And The Blob has been one of my horror films for years. I mean, I really just love all the people that get melted. I think it's really fun. But I also love the subversiveness of this movie because it takes everything about the original that was very straightforward and clean cut and uses it as the basis for this conspiracy theory, very critical of the US government sort of horror story. And so of course when I wanted to talk about this remake, I obviously needed to talk about the original as well. And the original has its charms, but I don't think it's a very good movie. It's kinda sleepy and boring, even if it is sort of a cornerstone of that 50s sci-fi horror boom. Really, I think that talking about the original Blob is more interesting to me than actually watching the Blob. But I just love this remake so very much. And I think that Kevin Dillon and Shawnee Smith make two awesome leads for this movie. And of course Shawnee Smith would go on to be in the Saw movies as well, which maybe I'll talk about those Saw movies someday. It's not really a priority for me. But of course I love getting into all the special effects of the movie as well, because they are some of the best that I've ever seen in a horror movie. And this is just on the cusp of CGI taking over in mainstream movies as well, and special effects and practical effects were just at their height at this moment before CGI. So it comes at a really special time for not only horror, but movies in general. And like I said, I feel like this is still an underappreciated horror remake classic, especially when compared to something like The Thing or The Fly, which are really the two pillars of horror remakes, especially from the 80s. And while I would have loved for this movie to have a sequel, it is great just on its own. But it is a really tantalizing idea of the Blob in the Midwest propelled by religious fervor. But it's okay that it didn't get a sequel because it ends with that awesome hair metal song Brave New Love by Alien, which I just love a good hair metal song over the end credits of a movie. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Blob remake, the original Blob, and horror remakes in general. Where does this one stack up for you in the larger canon of those? As always, a huge shout out to my patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video and exclusive Patreon-only reviews voted on by my patrons every month, with the newest one being a review of John Woo's Hard Boiled, starring Chow Yun-fat. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, and if a suspicious meteor just happens to land in your backyard, don't poke it with a stick.